So could you tell us a little bit about the paper you're presenting at the conference?
Well, it's called Sexual Nationalisms, Old and New in the Age of Terror, which means I'm confronting two moments mostly. One, that's the years 2000, and that's when basically the clash of civilizations became the sexual clash of civilizations, with the idea that the difference between us and them, whether you're talking about religion or immigration, the difference is sexual. That is, we are supposed to be nice to women, we're supposed to be nice to gays and lesbians, but they're supposed to be sexist and homophobic. That was the big argument of the years 2000, starting in the Netherlands, but also throughout Europe as a way of dealing with immigration, and internationally, including with the US going to Afghanistan under this logic. This, I think, has changed in the last few years, in the years 2010, in France, as we saw with the debate on gay marriage, because in fact there was a mobilization against gay marriage, which was not premised on the idea that we're supposed to be sexually modern, but on the contrary, that our national identity is based on being sexually conservative, traditional. And this is not specific to France. I think if we look at the reactions to the all kinds of events in the world, we see a reaction against gender, against so-called gender theory. So it seems to me that when we see these two moments, one which is premised on the new sexual nationalisms of sexual modernity, and the return of the old sexual nationalisms against women, against gays, and sometimes against Jews, then we see two competing reactionary models, and we have to take both into account.
How do you see the themes of your paper addressing the themes of the conference more broadly?
I think the conference was based in part on the experience of people interested in Eastern Europe, not just Western Europe. What strikes me is that in fact we're looking at this from different angles, but we end up with a story that I think is coherent. Somewhat paradoxically, because in fact we look at it from the point of view of the nation, but in fact the point of view of the nation can be looked at from a different scale. And the different scale means that in fact what's going on as essentially French is not essentially French. What's going on as essentially Polish, about Polish identity, is not just Polish, etc. So the advantage of this for me is that we look at national issues from an international point of view, from a transnational point of view, and in particular what we see emerging is what could be called the anti-gender international. At the same time, what we realize is that it's not just about nation, it's not just about sex. These days it's also more specifically about religion and secularism. And of course France in that respect is a sort of archetype, because secularism is supposed to be essential to French identity. So all these themes converge to have a conversation that on the one hand points out differences, but on the other hand points to a general context.
How do you see your work more broadly addressing these themes?
Well, my work has been about gender forever, which means that I've taken seriously the definition given by Joan Scott in 1986, which is twofold. On the one hand, gender is about the social organization of sexual difference or perceived sexual differences. That's familiar, but the more novel and to me the more productive definition that she gave is the second part. That is the idea that gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power, which can translate as gender is not just about gender, gender is about everything else. It's about class, it's about race, it's about religion, it's about nation, etc. So this discussion about what's going on in Europe today or what's going on in the world, for me, is part of a general discussion that has been going on in gender studies for a long time. That is, how is gender the prism through which we can understand the world? And the reason why we can't understand the world through this prism is because people use the prism of gender to think about the world. So the work of social scientists, in a way, reflects the practices of social actors.
And for those of us who are less familiar with the specific context in France, could you maybe give us a sense of how gender, nation, and secularism kind of play out?
Well, one of my main arguments, not just today, but more generally in the last almost 30 years, one of my arguments, which of course is not specific to me, is that we should resist culturalism. That is the idea that what's going on in France is due to the fact that France is French. And the French are French, and therefore they act Frenchly, which of course, as you know, can apply to any other country. And this is what America is all about. And this kind of exceptionalism is anything but exceptional. It seems that exceptionalism is a universal rule. So what I try to do is to avoid looking for something essentially French. I'm not trying to insist on the fact that the French are essentially laïque, that is secular, for example, or that they have a given definition of gender or a tradition of the harmony of the sexes, or etc. On the contrary, I try to point out how these rhetorics, first, are rhetorics, that is, they're not the reality of how it works, but they're rationalizations, and how these political discourses also keep changing, which means that the place of religion in France is not a given, it's not a constant, it's not something that transcends French history. To take one example, the fact that the Catholic Church was so prominent in the recent reaction against gay marriage in the years 2010 might give the impression that it's just a legacy of the past, that this has always been the way France works, with a strong Catholic tradition. But then how do we understand that the Catholic Church was almost absent at the end of the 1990s during the first debate on the civil unions called Pax? In order to understand that, you cannot just look at culture, you have to look at politics and how things change. So this is much of my work, debunking the idea that we know about France because it's the sort of eternal reflection of Frenchness, in the same way that I've tried to do similar work about the US, trying to debunk the idea that Americanness is expressed in everything that happens in America. I think that what is happening in France today is unexpected. Just like what is happening in the US is unexpected, it's not something that can be deduced from past circumstances. Things happen, and they were not planned. And social scientists, even me, had not anticipated them.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little about the past and the present, and I know you said you can't anticipate the future, but do you have any sense of how the situation will evolve moving forward?
Well, the way it works is that on the one hand, things happen that we did not expect. On the other hand, there's a logic of things. So what it means is that while we remain in the same logic, we can sort of anticipate. So if you're thinking today about the reaction against gender theory or so-called gender theory, we can assume that it's going to continue because in part it's based on populist anti-intellectualism. And this means that we can imagine that what is going on in France, what is going on in Brazil, what is going on in Poland might very well happen in countries that have been relatively untouched by this. So we can imagine that things will sort of proceed according to the same logic. At the same time, what we've seen in the last few years is that not only do you have a succession of logics, sexual modernity as a way of discrediting, delegitimizing foreigners and Muslims, and then the opposite, the rejection of sexual modernity in the name of national identity. That means that you can go one way or the other, which is why it's so hard to anticipate, because actually those rhetorics can mobilize differently different people. So the that's why we have politics, and that's why politics matters, because politics is about deciding which rhetoric is going to prevail, which reading of the world will matter more. And so I do believe that we have to pay close attention to what's going on, and that's the work of the social sciences. And the reason why we do is because it matters politically and because we're concerned by what's going on. We're not just bystanders, we're actors, whether we like it or not, and even if we're social scientists.
And how do you see your work evolving to address these shifts?
Well, one issue that I have started working on more specifically is populism. I just recently published a book on populism, which is an attempt to understand what has been presented as a populist moment. And this has followed the Brexit vote and the Trump election, and with the prospect of elections in France and Germany, etc. And so it seems to me that it's important to understand what's going on in politics in order to understand what's going to happen in sexual matters, in matters of gender and sexuality. So that's one thing, and that's for me a politically urgent thing to do. On the other hand, I have work that is in preparation on what I called le genre français, French gender, or the Frenchness of gender as a way of denationalizing, of sort of reversing the inverting the usual image of gender being alien to France and being essentially American or non-French. And so making this into an essentially, of course with some irony, essentially French feature. So that's a second dimension. And there's a third dimension about which I've been thinking for quite a while, is to try to reflect on the methodological implications of all this, and trying to think more seriously about what I would call an ethnography of the public sphere. What this means is that we tend to have ethnography for everyday practices. And we tend to assume that it means leaving out the public sphere, or the public sphere only insofar as it determines the conditions for everyday life. It so happens that I have been very active in public debates, and so this public involvement means that in practice, working on public debates and participating in public debates more and more appears to me like participant observation in the public sphere. And so I do want to reflect more on what this implies. It's a complicated exercise because it might seem like sort of self-aggrandizement, and so I'm nervous about that. But I think at the same time it's important to reflect on the fact that in order to understand what's going on in the public sphere, it helps if you care about what's going on in the public sphere. And so that's why it's not just observation, but also participation. That we know from ethnography in general, and I think we can keep that rule when applied to the ethnography of the public sphere. So that's one of my intellectual ambitions for the years to come.
So lastly, I wanted to ask if you had any book recommendations. You mentioned a book that you just wrote that came out, but if you have any others as well.
Well, the work of others is always important, and for example, I've been using the work of Joan Scott for many years, and there's a forthcoming book by Joan Scott called Sex and Secularism that I'm hoping to get published in France under the title Laïcité sexuelle, and so that I think would be quite relevant to all these discussions. But there are many more, of course, and what is interesting is that there has been a lot of work produced in English on issues like homo-nationalism and femo-nationalism, etc. And that's very useful. But there has also been more and more work produced by young scholars in France and not just in France, but also in Belgium and Switzerland, etc., and French-speaking countries, that I think has been quite interesting. Some are my students and some are not, but I think there's a whole generation of young scholars who in particular have looked at something that had been relatively absent from the English-speaking discussion on homonationalism and feminationalism, that is the question of religion. For example, there was a big conference organized by young scholars in Brussels called Habemus Gender, whose title already made me happy, but whose contents were equally interesting. So what is interesting, in fact, is when we have a chance to look at the work that has been produced in different places and by different generations. And as we know, we have a great deal to learn, both from those who came before, but also from those who are soon replacing us.
Thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you.